what is the story with containers and OpenStack? Many people have started to deploy OpenStack as a technology specifically focused on managing infrastructure for their data center environments, especially in a private cloud environment. But most of that focus has been on the virtual machine environment. So basically replacing something like a VMware vSphere with OpenStack as a way of managing the greater number of virtual machines that engineers are looking to deploy. One of the things that's driving that greater number of virtual machines and the interest in tools like OpenStack is the development environment is starting to change. People are looking at DevOps as their model for workflow. So they're looking at developing and operating, or basically infrastructure as code is usually the way it's described. With those changes and a desire to be able to take an application component and not necessarily have to operate the entire system from the bare metal service all the way up through the operating system, the virtual machine components, potentially device drivers, things of that nature, making sure all the security components are secured and taken care of. Rather than having to manage all of that, the container world lets you just manage the specific libraries and application components that the developers are working on directly, and that makes their lives a little bit easier. So the developers and the developer plus operations for their application make a little bit more sense. They know what they're working with rather than all these other pieces that maybe they don't have as much experience with. So there's a real interest in enabling these container sorts of environments. So that's the first thing that's pushing this. When the developers start using containers, then they start saying, well, maybe I don't necessarily want to deploy virtual machines. I just want containers as service, as a way of working with that same systems model, but with the nice flexibility of an API-driven enablement. Hey, I can just turn a service on or off. I have more than a single machine, which you could do with Docker being one of the container management tools, for example. You could deploy Docker onto a machine and spin up a lot of containers against that machine, against APIs, but you don't have the flexibility of the entire data center doing that. So the container model makes sense. Container as a service makes sense. And so if infrastructure as a service is being handled by OpenStack, people then say, well, can I do container as a service with OpenStack? Wouldn't that be nice too? So that's one model by which people are talking about containers and OpenStack. The other model is that people are saying, well, OpenStack is just a piece of software in and of itself. Why can't I deploy OpenStack as containers? And so this is the other approach, is to say, well, if it's just software, what if I had a container management layer, and from that container management layer could then actually deploy OpenStack on top of those containers as containers. Now, OpenStack wasn't really designed from the ground up to be a service that works well in a container or even a web scale environment necessarily. It was intended to support that web scale service, but wasn't built for that initial purpose. So people have been working on fixing the glitches as they were where OpenStack wasn't quite ready for this. And the biggest project that's working on that today is a project called Project Kolla, K-O-L-L-A. It's actually very well supported. There are 50 or 60 developers that are working on it almost full time, I believe. And they're focused on containerizing OpenStack services, sort of managing the short-term container lifecycle of any one individual component. They're using other projects, specifically the OpenStack Ansible project, to actually help automate the service rendering of those individual components. But that's what enables OpenStack to run on top of containers. Now, it's not necessarily the end of the story, because there's more likely other issues that you have to deal with. And we'll actually talk about that in our next blog segment.